You know, there's a specific kind of silence out here in the valley, the kind that feels heavy, like a wet wool blanket, especially around midnight when the wind dies down and the only thing moving is the creek cutting through the granite. But at exactly 12:03 a.m. last Tuesday, that silence broke, and it didn't break because of a coyote or a falling branch. It broke because three men with tactical flashlights and bad intentions decided to cross a boundary line that my family has held for 3 generations. They thought they were hunting me. They thought they were the predators in a dark forest. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that I had spent the last 6 hours turning my entire property into a stage, and they were walking right into the spotlight of a trap built entirely on their own arrogance. See, you never forget the moment a quiet piece of land suddenly feels wrong. I've lived in this valley for 30 years, long enough to know every bend in the creek, every pine that leans just a little too far over the ridge, every crunch of gravel on the old dirt road. And when you know a place that well, a wrong sound hits you like a cracked bone in a still room. That night, the sound was a sputtering little engine, an ATV moving slow, the kind of slow a man uses when he isn't lost but searching for an edge. So I stepped out onto the porch, pulled on my jacket, and let my eyes settle into the dark. There was no moon that night, just a thin ribbon of silver fog sliding along the ridge, just enough light to see anything that shouldn't have been there. And that's when I caught the first flash, not a ranch truck, not a hunter's lamp, but the sharp, white strobe of tactical flashlights, the kind sold to folks who want to look like professionals but don't have the training to back it up. 3 figures came stumbling out of the tree line, heading straight toward my creek, and they weren't quiet, they weren't careful, they moved the way bullies do, loud and sure of themselves, like the world was theirs to stomp across. As they got closer, I slipped along the fence line, staying in the shadows until I could see them clearly, and honestly, it was almost laughable. They were wearing what I'd call cosplay commando gear, cheap vests, helmets that were still shiny from the factory, radios hissing so loud a death mule could have tracked them. I've worked beside real officers, real tactical men who understand silence and shadows, and these 3 were the opposite. They were playing soldier on somebody else's land. I stopped right at my boundary marker, the legal line, where my porch light left just enough glow for them to see my face, and the tall one, a guy I'd later know as Gunnar, strutted forward like his authority came from his costume, not a badge. "Evening, landowner," he said, stretching the words out like he was auditioning for a bad cop show. But I didn't answer. I just stared down at the metal stake they had driven into my soil, exactly 1 inch onto my side of the line. He followed my eyes and smirked, realizing I saw it, and said, "You're 1 signature away from being bulldozed." And then he made his biggest mistake, the one that would cost him everything. He tapped the holster on his hip twice, slow, deliberate, and pointed his finger at my chest like a child making a gun, saying, "You're 1 bullet away from being a corpse." What he didn't know was that the high-fidelity microphone in my jacket pocket had been recording the moment I stepped off my porch, capturing every word, every threat, every stupid choice. I held his stare and just said, "That's helpful. Deputy Miller is going to love hearing that." And the other 2 laughed, loud and clueless, not realizing they'd just crossed 2 boundaries, my fence line and the law. I didn't yet know exactly why they were out here, why the Whispering Pines HOA had suddenly sent hired muscle to my doorstep, but I knew this much. Tonight wasn't the start of their plan, it was the start of mine. A slow, patient trap built from their own words, and the kind of cold anger only a landowner feels when strangers think they can redraw the map. People called it the borderline trap later, but to understand it, you have to understand that land disputes don't usually start with fences. They start with something hidden, something worth real money. And in this valley, the thing worth the most wasn't the dirt, it was the water. The morning after those 3 amateurs strutted across my land, I drove into town to get answers, pulling into the county office just as the gray sky was breaking. And the clerk, a woman named Mrs. Higgins who's been there since the Reagan administration, looked up over her bifocals and asked if I was in trouble. "Not yet," I told her, "but I think someone's trying to start some." And I handed her the forged land realignment notice someone had slid under my door the day before. She squinted at it, turned it sideways, then upside down, the way old-timers do when they're too polite to call something garbage, and finally sighed, telling me it was fake as a $3 bill. I asked her who filed something like this, and she spun her monitor around to show me a brand new application filed by the Whispering Pines HOA requesting a repair and safety expansion zone. Most folks don't know what that means, but if you're a rancher or a grower, you know, it meant they wanted control of the creek, my creek, the one that runs cold year-round because it comes straight off the granite shelf, the one that feeds my vines. The paperwork included these big, glossy drawings showing a lovely artificial lake for community recreation, which meant they wanted to dam my creek, siphon the flow, and feed a lake that would boost their property values by $100,000 a pop. They weren't trying to expand their neighborhood. They were trying to expand their bank accounts. And the clerk clicked to the next page showing a proposed construction outline with concrete retaining walls and a pump system, with a bold note claiming affected landowners notified. Which was a lie, plain and simple. Mrs. Higgins looked at me with that quiet sympathy and said, "Elias, they're trying to take your watershed." I felt my jaw tighten, not in explosive anger, but in that steady resolve you get when someone tries to take the thing your life depends on, because water is life out here. It's not a decoration. I walked out of there knowing that the creek wasn't just water anymore. It was leverage, and it was the reason I was going to set a trap they'd walk straight into with their eyes wide open. I got back home just before noon, and the house felt different, expectant, and I sat at the kitchen table analyzing the fake notice, the embossed trim, the gold seal, the legal phrases copied out of context. It was all designed to intimidate someone they thought was too old or too isolated to fight back. But by late afternoon, as the shadows started stretching across the porch, the situation escalated from paperwork to something human. I was standing outside listening to the wind when I heard uneven, dragging footsteps coming up the driveway, and out of the shadows emerged Toby, the HOA's junior accountant, a guy with no reason to be on my land at night. He stopped at the bottom step, sweating despite the cold, looking like a man who had run out of good decisions and was now choosing between bad ones. "Elias," he said, voice shaky. "We need to talk. They're planning something worse than you think." I didn't invite him in. Not yet. I just told him to start talking, and he spilled everything. He told me about Patricia Sterling, the HOA board president, and the group she hired called Vanguard Solutions, which wasn't a licensed security firm but a bunch of washed-out ex-cops and weekend warriors who thought putting on tactical gear made them special ops. "She wants your land swallowed into HOA jurisdiction by force," Toby said, trembling. "She sent those 3 men last night to push you, to get you angry, to get you on record making threats so she can get a court injunction. Gunnar, the tall one, he's supposed to escalate tonight. She told him to make you slip." He looked at me, fear and shame tangled on his face, and admitted that he knew I caught the threat on audio, which was why Patricia was panicking and accelerating her timeline. Then he handed me a folded sheet of paper with a login name and password to the real books, double payments to contractors, off-the-books invoices, transfers going straight to accounts linked to Gunnar's brother. Patricia, she told me to falsify parts of the report," Toby whispered. "She wants your creek rights so she can double the expansion, and she promised developers she'd deliver. I'm not going to jail for her lake house dream, Elias." He handed me the keys to the kingdom, proof that this wasn't just a boundary dispute, it was racketeering. I told him to go home, act normal, and never mention he was here, and as soon as his footsteps faded, I turned toward my workshop because the trap I needed wasn't going to build itself, and Vanguard Solutions had just volunteered to be the test subjects. I didn't grab weapons. That's what they wanted. They wanted armed resistance to paint me as the crazy local. Instead, I grabbed tools. I took 2 industrial halogen towers, a battery backup pack, 2 directional floodlights, a wildfire-grade emergency strobe, 10-gauge copper wire, and 4 steel stakes. I loaded it all onto the ATV and rode out to the creek under the cover of a cloud-heavy sky, planting the stakes deep into the hard soil, burying the wiring, and laying the halogens under the canopy gaps where the beams could blast upward like artillery fire. I set the strobe high-centered on the ridge, pointed directly where they always crossed, and by 3:17 a.m., I was back on the porch, flipping a switch to activate a wide-angle roof camera I'd hardwired earlier. No Wi-Fi, no cloud, unhackable. Everything from this moment forward was mine on record. I killed every exterior light on the property, letting the darkness pool in around the house, and waited. For a few minutes, nothing moved, And then I felt it. A tremor in the ground, soft, rhythmic boots, 3 sets, coming the same way as before, because lazy men repeat the routes they feel comfortable with. Their flashlights bobbed through the trees, jittery and sloppy, and I heard Gunnar's voice cut through the dark. Spread out. Keep eyes on the porch. One of his guys whispered, "Man, it's dark as hell." And Gunnar grunted, "Good. Means he's blind." I smiled in the shadows because, no, son, I wasn't blind, I was hunting. They reached the boundary line, the actual legal line, and Gunnar shined his light across it, hesitated, and then stepped over. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 feet. The roof camera caught the trespass, the audio caught the intent, and that was my cue. I touched the porch rail where I'd mounted the trigger switch, and click. The valley erupted. A wall of white halogen blasted upward through the trees, turning night into noon in a single heartbeat, while the ridge strobe detonated behind them, a pulsing backlight that hammered their retinas and carved their silhouettes into the darkness like cardboard cutouts. Gunnar screamed, shielding his eyes, and the other 2 dropped to the dirt, thinking they were under fire. But there were no bullets, just physics. Light is louder than any gunshot when you don't expect it. I stepped out onto the porch, calm, hands visible, voice steady. "Gunnar," I said, "your men are trespassing on recorded land. My camera is capturing every second, and Sheriff Miller gets the file the moment I hit send." He spun around, wild, eyes shrunk to pinpoints, and then he said it. He made the mistake that would follow him into a courtroom. "You stepped toward me," he shouted, tapping his holster hard. "Once, twice, and I'll put you down right here." Perfect. Crystal clear on the recorder, crystal clear on the roof camera. A death threat on my land, during a trespass, while armed. "You think lights are going to stop us?" he barked, trying to find his bravado, but I just lifted my phone and tapped the screen, sending the file. "No," I said, "your own words are." Then, a figure burst from the shadows near the barn. It was Toby, sweating, gasping, looking terrified but running toward us anyway. I frowned because I told him to stay away, but he collapsed against the porch rail holding a cracked tablet. "I couldn't let you face this alone," he choked out. I saw Patricia send the final order. Gunnar froze. "What are you doing here, Toby?" "I'm done covering for criminals," Toby said, his voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. He held up the tablet. "She sent the order at 2:11 a.m. Cross the line now. No hesitation. Force a reaction. If he resists, good, we need incident justification." The words hung in the air like frost. Gunnar lunged as if he could snatch the tablet, but his own men stepped between us, looking at him with betrayal in their eyes. "You said it was legal," one of them hissed. "You said she wanted dirt, not a felony trap." And just like that, Vanguard Solutions wasn't a team anymore. It was one desperate leader and 2 men realizing they'd been fed to the wolves. I raised the porch phone. "Sheriff Miller, you're going to want to come now." Gunnar flinched so hard he stumbled, knowing that tonight wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about consequences. The night held frozen for a moment, suspended between wrongdoing and the law, until the sound of gravel crushing under heavy tires drifted up the valley. No sirens, just the hum of a county vehicle approaching with authority. Sheriff Miller emerged from the dark, calm, methodical, stepping into the white glow of my trap like he'd rehearsed it. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, tipping his hat. "Gunnar, I know every inch of this county's jurisdiction, and you are trespassing, armed, at night, against a landowner who told you to leave." "The camera is illegal," Gunnar stammered. "Nope," Miller replied. "It's on his land, facing his land. Drop the weapons, all of you, slowly." The 2 contractors complied immediately, placing their holsters on the ground, but Gunnar froze, realizing that letting go of the weapon was admitting his authority was a costume. "Now," Miller said, his tone dropping an octave, and Gunnar finally obeyed, his gun clattering into the dirt. I handed Miller the tablet Toby had brought. "Patricia sent these orders?" Miller asked, scrolling through the damning text chain. "This is conspiracy, trespass, and coercion at minimum." Then, headlights flared at the ridge. A black Mercedes coasted to a stop, and Patricia Sterling stormed out, wearing a trench coat over her nightgown, shouting, "This is not authorized. You were not supposed to get caught." She froze when she saw the scene, her men disarmed, exposed, bathed in halogen light. Miller turned to her, calm as stone. "Mrs. Sterling, nice of you to join us. You're being detained for questioning in a criminal conspiracy." I'm the HOA president," she sputtered, as if that title held weight out here in the real world. "And I'm the deputy with jurisdiction," Miller replied. Behind her, the Mercedes door opened. But it wasn't a person, it was her purse that had fallen open on the seat, revealing stacks of paperwork and an envelope stuffed thick with cash. It was over. The handcuffs clicked on Gunnar, then on Patricia, the sound echoing across the valley like a gavel strike. We didn't stop there. Miller turned to me and said, "This isn't stopping at the creek. We're getting warrants tonight." Before sunrise, we were parked outside Gunnar's house, and what we found in his garage turned the stomachs of every deputy on the scene. It wasn't just a garage, it was a war room. The walls were covered in maps, pinned and layered, with my land circled in thick red marker labeled Target. There were surveillance photos of me, my neighbors, even my porch taken from the ridge. But under the bench, in an old plastic tote, we found zip ties, flex cuffs, duct tape, and 3 AR-15s with the serial numbers filed off. "This isn't intimidation," a deputy whispered. "This is a kidnapping kit." Miller knelt down, checking the chamber of one of the rifles. "Loaded," he said quietly. "Elias, if you hadn't triggered him tonight, if you hadn't exposed this, he wasn't planning to scare you. He was planning to remove you." We moved on to the HOA office next, breaking the lock on the front door. Inside the safe hidden behind a crooked watercolor painting, we found the blueprints for the dam, the expansion Phase 2 contracts that sold lots they didn't own yet, and a list of every homeowner marked as compliant or target. My name was at the top. Toby's name was underlined twice. The trial began 3 months later, and by then, the community had changed. The HOA was under state trusteeship, and the courtroom was packed with neighbors who finally understood the bullet they'd dodged. Patricia tried to walk in like she still owned the place, but the memory of handcuffs had rewritten her posture. The prosecution played the recording, one bullet away from being a corpse, and then projected Patricia's text, "Cross the line immediately. Ignore him." The jury didn't need to be lawyers to understand what they were seeing. Miles took the stand, shaking but truthful, and admitted everything. Then I took the stand, looking the jury in the eye, telling them this wasn't about rules, it was about control, about turning a community into a weapon. The verdict came back in 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy, racketeering, extortion, illegal surveillance. Gunnar got 25 years for the weapons and the threats. Patricia got 19 years plus full restitution. The judge looked at her and said, "You twisted a community into a tool for personal gain, and your greed was matched only by your cruelty." When the gavel came down, dissolving the Whispering Pines HOA board effectively immediately, a ripple of relief went through the room that felt like a collective exhale. 6 months is a funny amount of time, long enough for weeds to grow, for a vineyard to settle, for scars to turn into stories. By the start of summer, the valley felt different, not louder, just free. No patrol lights on the ridge, no drones buzzing overhead. I spent my mornings walking the perimeter, and where Gunnar had crossed with a gun, wildflowers had taken over. I installed a new sign at the gate, "Private property. No trespass. No HOA jurisdiction." That afternoon, neighbors started arriving for the first harvest festival in years. Real neighbors, laughing, carrying dishes, not looking over their shoulders. Ramirez showed up in jeans. Toby came with his wife, looking lighter than I'd ever seen him. We lit the fire pit, poured the wine, and I raised a glass to the boundaries we defend, not just the lines on the map, but the lines between right and wrong. And looking around at the faces glowing in the firelight, hearing the music play softly under the stars, I realized the valley wasn't just quiet again. It was whole. So, here's my question for you folks. We all know HOAs can be a pain, but at what point does community standards cross the line into organized crime? Have you ever had a dispute over a boundary that felt like it was about something much deeper? I want to hear your stories in the comments. Let's talk about the lines we draw and the ones we refuse to let anyone cross. Thanks for listening.